Welcome back. You're watching Newslink. Now, Africa is a continent made up of 54 incredibly diverse nations. Each of these have their own unique political, linguistic and administrative systems. Now, business strategist Dr. Rutendo Huindingwi has written a book, Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded, focusing on the key commercial connections binding these countries together. In discussing those challenges of doing business in Africa, he draws conclusions from the famous Rumble in the Jungle heavyweight boxing match in Zaire in 1974 between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. Let's discuss this further with him. He is in studio. Once again, thank you very much for talking to us. It was quite an interesting read because we get a lot of content around the African continent and the issues and the opportunities that exist. But I quite enjoyed this read, and we'll unpack that in a moment. I just want to reflect on the first chapter where you speak about Africa as a land of a crisis. What exactly did you mean here?
I think what I was trying to highlight then, again, thank you for having me on the news today, Refiwe. I think the most important thing when you talk about crisis, it's more to align to, as much as there's opportunity, there's challenges. And the idea really is to focus on the idea that 54 countries, we've got a number of challenges that are there, there are a number of things that are going on, but ultimately there's a huge way of opportunity. And the first thing that I kind of highlight in that chapter as well is that because of that, you have to understand the territory. You have to understand the dynamics in terms of what makes up the opportunities that align with that crisis. So that sort of lays the foundation of the discussion of understanding the opportunities of the African market.
I mean, it sounds quite an optimistic answer that you gave, which is ironic because you have been labeled as the African realist, very cognizant of what is going on the continent. And maybe just talk us through some of those major issues that you have found along the way that really prevent Africa from being as connected as one would like to see.
That's a good point, Refiwe. I think the key thing is the reason I labeled myself as a realist, it was a healthy blend of labeling myself as being optimistic, but at the same time being realistic with the challenges we have. Because I think the danger that is there most of the times is that we can be covered by this blanket of saying there's so much opportunity and be over-optimistic in Africa, when in reality there is opportunity. We've got civil wars, we've got health challenges, we've got political challenges, but at the same time it's a continent brimming with people with vision, with passion. They've gone through a lot, but there's a lot more to do. There's great things that we're achieving in terms of the different leaders and the different people of the continent, the diverse cultures that are there. So it was really to bring out that aspect, saying that as much as there's challenges, there's also an optimistic outlook, and that's why the realistic branding of myself, so to speak.
Let's move on. That's very important because it was going to lead me to my next point about knowing your threats. That's one of the themes you would address in the book, and the references that you make with the Muhammad Ali boxing match are actually quite extraordinary because they describe it so well, in that you shouldn't underestimate or overlook certain things, right, or take them for granted. And I just want to read the little excerpt you said there. So the reference to the fight, and then you said, as much as Ali had a big mouth, he had gorged and prepared for the very real threat of George Foreman. That is a very important point, in that we can play big, but the threats are there and we need to be cognizant and we need to be able to address them.
Yeah, that's 100%. I think, just drawing from the fight again in terms of, I mean, if people who actually view the fight, you remember the time when you read about the fight. Muhammad Ali was quite, as much as he's a big mouth, he had a big heart, he had a big character, but he knew that George Foreman was stronger than him, he was younger than him, and he was the reigning world boxing champion. So he knew that in order for him to win the fight, he had to think out of the box, he had to realize George Foreman was a true threat, and he had to navigate around that. And that's what I try to highlight in the book. The same thing with Africa, is that as much as we are a great continent with great people, the world out there is bigger than us. I mean, Africa's GDP is 3% of global GDP. Some can look at that as in a negative sense and say, gosh, we're so small. But in the other sense, you realize, okay, we're 3% of global GDP, but we can tap into the 97%, which is the bigger picture. How do we do that? So it's a different kind of angle. And your Singapores or your Japans have done that. They are not big countries in terms of people, in terms of geographical size, but they have thought out of the box and then have tapped into the global economy. And now we have Toyota in Africa, which is a car, but you think it's an African car because there's so many of those vehicles around. So that's where I was coming from in terms of, you look at the threats in terms of the bigger picture and you realize, okay, we're not as big as the opposition, but we can beat the opposition. And I'm not getting political here. I'm talking obviously economics. And from that angle, that's the kind of stimuli I'm bringing to the table with my book in terms of provoking thought and bringing people to align that way, whether you're a multinational in Africa, an African multinational grain to the rest of the world.
And that speaks to another theme you address around the challenges of doing business in Africa. The red tape, which is always spoken about by governments, but has never changed. Legislation comes in slowly, and so investors and businesses are frustrated with the current way in which business is done on the continent. Perhaps just reflect on that component for us.
That's a good point again, Rafiwe. And I think what I wanted to highlight there is that the danger that usually happens when you're doing business in Africa is that people want to take Africa as one piece of land, almost one simple or one similar socio-political system, when in fact there are 54 countries. So doing business in Rwanda, which is rated as one of the best countries to do business with from a statistical perspective, is totally different from doing in Botswana, it's totally different from doing in Egypt. So the idea is that when you understand the territory, you understand the dynamics, try to grasp and actually appreciate the uniqueness of each of those different entities or different markets, and then navigate and adapt your strategy specific to that. And that's what I'm trying to highlight in terms of that point, that in terms of complicated, yes, there's red tape. Any government, there's red tape. I've dealt with the US government. I sit on the board for the British Chamber of Commerce. I sit on the committee for the Digital Forum of the American Chamber of Commerce. And there's just as much complexities in their business models in terms of attracting investors in their country. But I think the unique aspect we have in Africa is that we can realize that we're different countries, different cultural groups, and if you navigate individually through them, there's an easier way to go about it.
Why was it so important for you, and this goes back to my initial comment earlier in the conversation, that the way in which the book is structured is actually quite extraordinary. You use case studies throughout the book. So it's not just you giving your thoughts of the African continent and what needs to change. There are actual case studies that you have referenced in the book. How important was that?
It was very important. I think the reason was when I was putting the book together, I wanted to highlight something very specific. I realized that, there's so many people who've written about Africa from an economic perspective. But what I wanted to highlight was that the success of doing business from Africa is obviously doing your research, which comes with the desktop research. I drew analogies from the fight, which was key just to make it a bit more exciting as opposed to boring. But more important, also bringing case studies of my own experience of doing business in Africa. I've opened up offices in Nigeria, I've worked in Kenya, in over 20 different African countries. I've worked with remarkable people who've given me their own history. So the combination of those three factors allows one to actually have a real tangible understanding of how to do business in Africa.
And then just a final thought, if you will. What is it that the reader takes away from this book? If nothing from our conversation, then hopefully they read the book and take away something. What would that be? I've
summarized the book in an acronym called TITO to the power of RD, which is understand your territory, T, be innovative, I, navigate through threats and opportunities, TO, and have relentless drive and determination to the power of RD. So TITO to the power of RD. Those 5 components make up the heart of the book, and if anything is to stimulate you, to provoke you, and to activate you to think differently about doing business on the African continent, and let the book act as a catalyst to drive you. I don't have all the answers, but hopefully I equip you with the right mindset and appreciation of the content for you to be successful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for such an insightful conversation with us this morning. Thank you very much. And so we were speaking about that book, Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded, Navigating Business on the African Continent.